So let's take an example of flashback as narrative structure. And let's take a look at a piece of writing that relies on flashback to give us some information about a character. This excerpt is taken from 100 Years of Solitude. It's a super famous book, and it's quite masterful in its language and its use of narrative technique. It begins with this flashback. And we know it's a flashback because we say many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Arellano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon. So when you see the words was to remember and many years later, we indicates that many years later he's remembering back to something that happened to him previously. And then he goes into a description of that flashback when he says he was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. At that time, Macondo was a village of 20 adobe houses built on the bank of a river of clear water that ran along a bed of polished stones, which were white and enormous like prehistoric eggs. The world was so recent that many things lacked names, and in order to indicate them, it was necessary to point. So already here we see the beginnings of the flashback, and we can identify it as a flashback, as I mentioned earlier in the video, because of the words many years later, and that he was to remember that distant afternoon, so we know it's flashback. No, the question is, what's the purpose of the flashback? Now, obviously, we're not reading the entire novel, but in this section of the text, the author has already indicated to us that our character is going to face a firing squad in the future. So we know that that is present day or future time for our character, but that his flashback is to a time of more innocent things. If you juxtapose the idea of the firing squad with that of the discovery of new wonders, they are two separate entities, two separate elements of the same person's life. So focus on what happens then in the flashback. He's identifying a memory which was important to him because he's spending time with his father and he's learning something new. So we don't know why this particular memory popped into his brain right at the moment of the firing squad, but it does serve purpose to showcase a more innocent time period in our character's life. So it begins the story with him facing a firing squad, but then immediately jumps back to a more innocent time in his life. So even though the use of flashback might not be used throughout the entire novel, we might flash back to the present, we've learned something in that tiny little few sentences about our main character. And that would be the purpose of the flashback in this sense. So that would be the narrative structure of flashback.